enjoy a seat at the table and good company, where great conversations and meaningful discussions happen.
I'm Sara Fiedelholtz, a conversationalist. Welcome to And Good Company, where you can enjoy a seat at the table for meaningful conversation. We all know that really what makes a dinner party great isn't the food, it's the conversation. It's the interaction of the company and the meaningful discussions and debates that they have. I am pleased to be in the company of Zach Benedict, a principal at MKM Design, Architecture and Design firm. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
So I have had the pleasure of knowing you now for 3 years.
Yeah.
And I always find that you are the epitome to me of what I call a true thought leader, and someone that I find that I can engage in conversation and discussion far beyond your experiences as an architect. And you really seem to be able to bring into your field of architecture and design a lot of your beliefs and ideas when it comes to urban sociology and urban planning and really thinking about people's livelihoods. So I always see that I always say that you're one of those people that I could have, hours and hours of conversation with, because I just think you have such an interesting
Thank you.
perspective. And so basically when I was thinking about this interview, I really just thought about, I could just sit here and ask you to just define all of these various concepts from, quality of place and the connection of placemaking and well-being, the socioeconomic benefits of age-friendly neighborhoods, the importance of inclusive civic space, And so what I wanted to do is really tap into your passion for well-designed places that create human connectivity and how that we can improve our well-being to reshape spaces. I doubt we're going to get to all of my topics and questions, so probably we will have to have a part 2.
Sure.
But let's start with the idea that your work as an architect and a designer. What do you like about that?
I think people that gravitate towards enjoying a career in architecture are ones that like complicated story problems. Like that to me is kind of the job description is you have the quantitative things like, projects still have to be on time, on budget, roofs don't leak, buildings don't fall down. But at the same time, I'd argue if you're doing the job well, which is the goal, you're also trying to figure out how to change, evolve, nudge cultures in a positive direction. So there's this kind of constant balance between the outputs of the realities of a tangible project and the outcomes of the people that those projects tend to support or encourage. And that to me is really the challenge and what gets you up in the morning.
And your firm spends as much time as it does thinking about the design as thinking about other aspects, and you oversee your firm's research, which can dive into a variety of topics.
Yeah, so our firm, we try to limit, I think you judge a firm by what it says no to.
Okay.
Right, so we'll work on any project that we think the client is sincerely interested in enhancing community health and well-being. So that ranges from acute care operating room renovations to public libraries and everything in between. The difference is we see that as the total spectrum of that idea of health and well-being. What it also tends to do for the majority of our work is because it's disproportionately heavy in healthcare settings.
Right.
We tend to design some of the most stressful and meaningful moments in people's lives. And it's not something we take lightly. So, you can say, well, you're just designing an operating room and then a waiting room. And these rooms, they become these kind of cold,
right.
Emotionless spaces.
Right.
But really, that's the room I'm going to sit for 2 hours while my father's on the operating table. And
Right.
how does that feel? And how can I, as a designer, help that experience?
Right.
And that, to me, is the challenge.
Well, your firms, I sort of believe the idea that you go about how you understand the work, how it affects someone's dignity, comfort, security, and happiness. And you talk about this idea of inherent design. What does that mean when you start thinking about a project?
I think it has to focus on the idea that you have to understand what the intent of that space is that you're designing as an architect, but maybe more importantly, understand that you're not that important. So the building is a platform for someone else to do really good work. As an architect, you design something, you help get it built, and then you leave. I leave. So when pick a hospital,
right.
These nurses and doctors and physicians are doing amazing things that I have no idea what they're doing. My only job is to make sure not only the building doesn't get in their way, but it increases their ability to do the things they do every day. And to understand that your real responsibility is to provide an effective platform for people, is to understand the inherent quality that space needs to have in order to do that. And you can't do that without understanding the culture of that organization, the leaders of that organization, the patients or consumers of that organization. That becomes the story problem. But that then becomes the backbone of how you define what is in fact inherent.
So based on that belief, your definition of good design is probably very different than most people would think how the building looks and how pretty it is. So how do you define good design?
With a potato peeler. So,
okay, right, that's the OXO potato peeler.
To us, that's how we explain it to people, is that that was designed for an arthritic hand.
Right, for an elderly. OXO made their way of creating products that were really designed for the elderly. So they made things bigger and
without marketing it as a geriatric kitchen utensil.
Right.
So that was the key, is good design not only is aesthetically pleasing and functional, but it is inherently accommodating a whole set of variables without asking for it to get pat on the back. They don't want credit for it. But there's a whole bunch of subliminal science in that product and the decisions surrounding that's design that it doesn't scream, look at me, or I'm pandering to a specific demographic. The good design is reliant on its ability to increase a more inclusive user group without taking credit for it.
Okay.
And to me, that's no different from a street to a building, you name it.
Okay.
If I can inherently provide a space that's more inclusive across a broad spectrum of variables,
right.
to me that's good design. And the more inclusive it can be, the better. And to approach it without that, I think's bordering on laziness and irresponsibility.
But that's also a contradiction to traditionally the role and belief of architects, like these Starchitects. It's really become that it is that it's sometimes it's more about the building or their ego or who built it than the design. So I think that's a surprising notion that you...
And there's a place for that, like iconic architecture, say in the... like an example of a nationally renowned art museum,
right,
might be able to take liberties that I would argue a public library should not take.
Right.
When you're talking about architecture as a democratic civic platform,
okay,
I think you have to concede that the real goal as a designer is not to be noticed. Right? You're creating an environment no different than I think a neighborhood of people is equivalent to a school of fish.
Okay.
Right?
Right.
And as a designer, you have to understand what that school of fish really need to thrive.
Okay.
And it's not a whole bunch of buildings that people look at and giggle that's a silly architect designed them. You can afford to have a couple of those. They help they help in your understanding of how to cognitively find your way around a community. It gives you a North Star.
Right. Well, it was like the Chicago 20 years ago when Getty redid Millennial Park.
Right.
That was what put Chicago on a map and a trajectory to change from being considered the flyover zone, the meat and potatoes town, and everybody dressed like the Michelin Man. So that did help to start that movement of shifting Chicago.
But then the next project that comes along has to reconcile whether or not it wants to support that or try to overshadow it.
Okay.
And when everything's special, no one is. So you have to understand that sensitivity. And I think too often architects get credit for ignoring that contextual
or you say
nature.
It's it looks, the form is good, but the function is bad. Yeah. So I mean, your firm focuses on specific areas, like you said, and you oversee the healthcare
Community health
community
mostly,
health, yeah. So, but let's talk a little bit first about, I was thinking about, because you've done like libraries and schools. So you've done the Homestead High School, Southwest Allen County Schools, you did the Wabash Carnegie Public Library and Huntington City Township Public Library. And what I was thinking about was, when you're in the process of creating and designing these buildings, how do you think about what and how they're going to be used in the future? Because these buildings are going to be there for quite a while, and things have changed. I mean, a library is not, for the 21st century, is not what it used to be, where you don't need rows and rows and places to store books.
Right.
So how do you, and with schools, I mean, the way that we teach and things are changing, and the use of technology and kids, being in pods and collaborative learning, or having their own projects, and then the teacher's the facilitator. How do you take that all into account to be able to create a building and a facility that serves a purpose, but also has to be able to adapt to the future needs? Yeah.
And that's the challenge, especially over the last 10, 15 years, and certainly in the next 10, 15 years, is really trying to create stagnant pieces of architecture that are nimble enough to react to the exponentially increased advances in technology. Like that's really the challenge.
Okay.
And that's probably the crux of your question is, I don't even know what technology libraries are going to use in 10 years.
Right.
It doesn't exist right now.
Right. I mean, I always say, we don't know what the jobs that
Right.
are going to be available
Right.
for. Yeah.
And
how do you take that into account in your design and planning?
Well, you first off, you admit you don't know, and you're not going to know. Like the healthcare world, when we design a building, say a hospital, by the time I'm done designing it and hand you a set of drawings, this project might not be done for 2 years.
Right.
The medical equipment you're going to put in that building didn't exist while I was
Right.
doing the drawings, and
Right.
you're only talking 18 months difference.
Right. Well, one of the big majors now, like with hospitals, is the fact that they need less overnight stay beds, because so much with the
Right.
technology, so much of it is done as quick day
Right.
surgeries. So they don't need so many beds, but they need more day surgery centers and quick recovery centers. And so really, you have to think of things like that and how that's changing.
And then the challenge as a designer becomes, how nimble can you make these buildings so that they don't necessarily need to endure another construction project to completely change their operational model, right? Staff have the ability
Right.
in some way to shape the operational management of that over the course of time. And there's a limit to that flexibility, and sometimes it comes at a cost. But those are the discussions that you have to balance. Couple that with the fact that I think a lot of the research we've done is to go back to this idea of inherent design, in that buildings like schools and libraries have a functional requirement. They have to provide certain things and services, but they also have to acknowledge the fact that they're social hubs for mammals
Right.
that have certain tendencies and instincts that if you as a designer don't understand those, you put the user in an awkward position, that they feel uncomfortable or misunderstood. There are things you can do to make people feel like they're more of part of a community. And a public library is a perfect platform to have that discussion. And there's ways you can design a building so that everyone feels like they have some collective ownership in that amenity. So you're constantly kind of juggling those two things.
Right. And then you're also constantly trying to get people to change and adapt to new ways of thinking about things.
Sure.
So when you talk about explain to me a little bit about this lifetime community movement.
Yeah.
And MKM has been very involved in one of the implementers pushing this forward. So let's talk a little bit about that, and then how sort of that parlays into health and well-being and the roles of the places that you create in the healthcare space.
We did some work funded by a series of grants. It's been a while now, 5, 6 years ago. And the goal was, or the challenge was, reconsider how communities could be developed in a way that would enhance their ability to serve people of all ages and abilities. As broad a spectrum as possible, and what design and planning changes could be made. And our work centered around reconsidering the systemic requirements in how communities fund and manage their own redevelopment. So, every time there's a new project, you hear of tax abatements, increment financing, all these development tools and subsidies. The argument with the bulk of our research for that was to try to understand how can we rethink this in a way that if the community is going to take their own money to reinvest in themselves, they can do it in a way that's going to support their evolving demographic for generations to come. So the example was, if you did a 10 or 20 year tax abatement, well, what does this community look like in 10 to 20 years? And are we sure that these funds are going towards a project that understands and helps us in some way elevate our ability to support the population we're going to have, not the one we might currently be exposed to.
Okay.
And the difference there being, because it was a subsidy, you didn't have to take it as a developer, but if you wanted it, you got to be on board with this.
Okay.
That we understand that between 2005 and 2040, Indiana's population grows by 15%.
Maybe a little less now because of the whole pandemic, and they're saying that people aren't having as many babies, that we all thought there was going to be a baby boom, but we're definitely going to see...
The population will grow by 15% because of outmigration.
Okay.
During that same time, the 65 and older population grows by 90%.
Right, and that's not going to change.
It likely get worse.
Right.
I think that's conservative. In a mid-market community like are so common in Indiana, the number's probably closer to 130%.
Okay. So what does that mean?
Well, that means you're going to have an entire a third of your population sincerely considering whether or not they should be driving. And that's a game changer that we're not prepared for and couldn't move fast enough now if we wanted to.
Right.
So trying to push municipalities and civic leaders to understand that we're going to have to rethink how we're structuring not only the requirements for development, but what we're encouraging.
Right.
And to do that, you have to understand what the future looks like. So this Lifelong Communities Development Initiative was to try to understand what would be the parameters of a healthy community, and how can we start to incentivize or nudge that development now in the right direction to be more supportive of the population we assume we're going to be.
So, so when you worked on the comprehensive plan for Bloomington and Ocean, Indiana, so did you, when you think about and Allen County now is in the process of doing its comprehensive plan, do you look at it from this approach of this, when you worked with those places with this lifetime community aspect? And so what changes then if you do it from this approach?
I think too often this is dramatic and unfair, but slightly true. I think too often these discussions about community redevelopment, whether it's directly said or it's inferred, what we're really talking about is how do we attract a 21-year-old entrepreneurial spirit that has a car but doesn't want to use it. That's kind of what you're saying. And the approach for some of that work is assuming, we're going to define quality of life by how well we can enhance the health and well-being of both ends of the bell curve, pre-driving teens and older adults.
Right.
If I can elevate the quality of life of those two populations, I will in fact elevate the quality of life of everyone in between.
Right, because you believe it's the engagement of these marginalized populations, like the teens before they drive, and then the...
Yeah, and the only reason we focus so much on older adults is because they have a louder lobbying voice than pre-driving teens. I mean, the strategies from a design and planning standpoint are identical. It doesn't seem to resonate as well. Pre-driving teens don't have their own AARP.
Right.
And that's just...
And they don't vote, which is part of the problem.
Or have disposable income to speak of. So we spend a lot of time focusing on, if you looked at our research, a lot of it deals with trying to understand how communities can absorb a larger older adult population. But the recommendations in terms of bricks and mortar strategies would be no different if you asked me the same question for a pre-driving teen.
But you're not necessarily an advocate of these over 50 communities or retirement communities. You like the idea of the multi-generational kind of community or neighborhood where you have across the spectrum of people living there.
I'm not an advocate as much as anyone over 50. What is it? 4% of all 4% of all people over 65 actually live in age-qualified housing.
Right.
It's a minuscule fraction of the market, and there'll always be that preference by that cohort.
Right.
But you have to balance that against the same people that will fill out surveys and say, I'd rather die than live in a retirement community.
Right.
They see that as a huge risk to their perceived independence.
Right.
Same people that once they move to a retirement community almost unanimously will say, I wish I would have done this earlier.
Right.
But you're dealing with that fear of being isolated and labeled.
And losing their independence.
Completely.
But now we also have a huge fear of, anybody over the age of 50 who is saying, there is no way I am going to a nursing home come hell or high water. There is absolutely no way. So now we've got to rethink this whole assisted living and nursing home type of environment because of the results of the pandemic.
And for years and for obvious reasons we might not have time for here, retirement campuses evolved into this full continuum of care where you had independent living on the same campus as skilled nursing.
Yeah, because they want you to be able to step down
and that was,
as your needs change.
And there was a market for that. There were people that want that.
Yeah.
And to remove the burden of home maintenance and all these other things that come with it. But there's also other ways to provide those services and minimize those tasks from individuals that I think you're going to start seeing creative destruction of some of these services, especially on the independent living side of the spectrum and probably not as much on the skilled nursing side because they're very different. They just happen to be geographically adjacent.
Right. And so taking into effect what are your ideas and beliefs of what makes a good community and a neighborhood, and then with the needs and issues of the aging population. So one of the interesting projects you did is this Piper Trail, where you created really a very different way to think about giving independent housing within a sort of environment in which there is assistance. So tell me about what you did there and what the thinking was behind it.
So our firm really was just trying to understand how you could reimagine an age-qualified community, neighborhood, and try to limit all preconceived notions of scale. So it really looks at a pocket neighborhood model, which isn't my term. That's a real
So
thing.
So let's stop for a second and explain what a pocket neighborhood is.
So it's really trying to understand that one of the inherent things that people really gravitate towards is trying to understand their sense of belonging in a shared commons. And the second you lose scale of that, you start feeling like you're not connected. You hear all the research on place attachment.
Right.
That's really kind of the back end of this is what are you attached to? It's the reason you use language like my school, my library, my park. Right? They're yours. You own a part of that emotionally, if anything. And what this did is it tried to understand at what scale could we create an environment that a series of residences, in this case detached homes, almost like small houses, but a little bit bigger, could share their own public commons. And then how long or often could that be repeated to create not only a larger neighborhood of kind of these, like a string of pearls on a necklace, but then they have kind of their own sovereign nation, their own shared commons that they could control, program, manage, operate in a way that them and their friends have some sort of shared responsibility and territory.
So how do they look different than when you look at just a neighborhood development, where it's just all the houses in that like community that has a name kind of thing?
So back to our potato peeler example, right? It's one of the functional programming requirements of a neighborhood like this is that you have to have vehicular access, right? While at the same time promoting things within walking distance. So in this case, it's kind of hard to explain. There's a central commons area. Around that is a series of homes. And then loaded to the rear is the garages. So there's these vehicular courts. But then all the pedestrian pathways highlight the social interaction that are found within the commons. And they were laid out in a way that they try to, as best they can, acknowledge the social capabilities of your average human. There's one odd thing. So there's a whole bunch of research on this. Like, someone has to be within roughly 300 feet before your brain recognizes an actual human. It's 30 feet before you can really recognize a facial expression.
Right.
Is that person angry, mad?
Right.
Do I recognize who
and
that
that'll
is?
probably be even less if you're elderly.
But there's not a lot of research on the elderly in this
Right.
way. So
Right.
we use a lot of the research that's more general.
Right. Which you can't.
Which you can't. So you do your best to try to shrink that down, assuming that there is some loss in capacity
Right.
to do so.
Because like with my father, for instance, he has a profound hearing loss.
Right.
And that creates tremendous difficulty
Right.
because he can't hear if someone across says hello to him.
Right.
And, it makes going to restaurants very difficult because of the ambient noise.
Right.
And so you have to take those things into
Yeah.
account. But the idea is that what you're doing, though, really of, creating the front porches and this community area, and then putting the garages and the vehicle part in the back is really what cities used to do.
Yeah, we're not
because that's what we
reinventing-
had
yeah.
alleyways. Yeah. And part of the problem is when we became so much of a car culture with the attached garages and we took away the front porches, then we took away that interaction, because also you have people now, they just drive into their garage, they put down the door, they go through the garage to their house, and they never see anybody. So it's sort of putting back those touch points of where there would be opportunity for engagement. Yeah. And I think that would be important, regardless if you're thinking about creating a community for senior citizens, or if you're creating what would be a great design for a neighborhood.
Correct. Again, same recommendation for a pre-driving teen. It doesn't matter in that way.
Right.
The front porch is a more complicated and effective tool than anyone wants to give it credit for. It was developed in the 1600s by the Danish.
Right.
It really does serve as this wonderfully efficient way for someone to let others know that they're willing to communicate and socialize, and it's easy for others to tell to what extent.
Right, and also because it's a defined, you're not going to come up on my porch,
Correct.
Unless I invite you.
Right,
So,
and it blurs the boundaries to soften the transition from public to private.
Right.
Where I've always said that's the difference. If you compare the difference to how Mr. Rogers gets into his house versus Batman.
Right.
Right, you just drive into the Batcave, shut the door, change your clothes.
Right.
Where Mr. Rogers is a totally different transition architecturally. That in that structure, he has the ability to engage others, most importantly on his own terms. Where the other one, you don't even have a choice.
Right.
You don't even have that as an option in your life.
Well, most people don't, because not only
No.
do they have the garage that they drive into and go to their home, but then they're in private gates and in a gated community, and so they're not. I mean, those clearly people are so much in that. Like a measure of success was everything private, like your own pool, your own gym, your own playground. I mean, that was measures of people's success, was how much they could have for themselves, as opposed to embracing sort of the we mentality of the community pool, of the public parks, and and I would think that, although I still believe that a lot of that me and mine is still very much prevalent, I like to believe within the ride-sharing community and the fact that we have scooters and bikes that people can rent and stuff, that is starting to soften, and especially with millennials, I think this understanding that I don't have to own it, and the idea of using third spaces or places, that they, it's not just all about being contained in their home.
Sure.
And hopefully with with everything with the pandemic, I think that's a two-sided sword, because we're sort of that people are making their homes so comfortable and so incredible with everything they could possibly need that they'll never need to leave their homes. But at the same time, people are realizing that even though they have everything in their homes and they have the greatest technology and televisions and sound systems, they're still missing that connection. So hopefully that's sort of changing. Like I was thinking, I was driving. I had the Bridges of Grace, Javier and Raina on a while ago, and so one of the things that I noticed, I drove around the Mount Vernon neighborhood because I wanted to get an understanding of what it is, and so one of the things that I thought about was having a lawnmower is very expensive. And so, and people, who are on fixed incomes or low incomes, not everybody needs to own a lawnmower. Like it could be like a library. Like you could check out the lawnmower, or like a toy lending library, or, so more of those kinds of things that become where you don't have to own it, that it can be like a public, use kind of thing, I think also helps to get us away from this me to we mentality. Do you think that that's true, or am I?
Yeah, I think for so long, the American dream was defined by confusing or conflating the connection between independence and isolation.
And privacy.
Correct, but you were only independent if you could live in an isolated fashion. You had to have everything for yourself privatized. And you see it on retirement communities. They call it independent living. Really what they mean is you still need to drive.
Right.
You've isolated to an extent you not quite need to be in the nursing facility yet.
Right.
And we've for so long accepted that this idea of independence, which you could argue is a myth anyway, was measured by how well you did in an isolated fashion. You needed your own lawnmower, you needed your own car, you needed all these things to be quote unquote successful.
Right.
I think the millennials now have come across to say that might not be true. At the same time, the baby boomers are realizing it isn't. They're realizing that just because I might need some help doesn't make me any less independent.
Right.
And we're now seeing a lot of creative ways of providing that help or services in ways that people still retain a sense of independence.
Right.
But I think we'd all be better off if we could learn as a group to reevaluate and appreciate this idea of dependency.
Right. And you talk a little bit, not about dependency per se, but reciprocity.
Yeah.
So, because I think reciprocity is different than dependency, because dependency implies that you have something to give me, but I don't really have something to give you. But reciprocity means you have something to give me, and I may have something different, but I do have something to give you.
Right.
And that you sort of think of the idea of how to build a neighborhood and a community with this idea of reciprocity. And you have I didn't know you were a mathematician, because you have a mathematical.
My brother is.
Oh, you have this mathematical equation. But talk to me a little bit about those components, about belonging, trust, collaboration, cooperation, that all comes into defining reciprocity.
So there's a big difference between solving problems with a consumer solution and a collaborative solution. And the example I sometimes give is take like Meals on Wheels. The real problem you're trying to solve is provide nutrition to marginalized populations. That's really the only problem you're trying to solve.
Right.
And the Meals on Wheels model was a consumer-based model that said, well, let's just get as much prepackaged meals as we can, and we'll give them to as many people as possible, which is a wonderful service for the community. But that's different than an evolving model that says, well, for those that are able, why don't we give them vouchers to participating restaurants, and then they can choose.
Right.
And at the same time, provide value as a consumer. Very, very different. One is a service that solves your problem. The other one is a solution that allowed that person to have a reciprocal relationship with the establishment of their choice. And the difference between the two is astronomical in terms of how that person, the user of this problem you're trying to solve, would define quality of life. How they would define their role in the community and their definition of what happiness is.
Right.
And to me, that idea of understanding and using it as a litmus test is at a global scale how everyone should define what good design is, right? Is good design leveraging more reciprocal relationships? If the answer is yes, we're probably onto something.
Okay.
If it's not, I get suspicious real quick.
Right.
And that's complicated because it's hard to be prescriptive about that. So communities sometimes will say, well, come in and tell us what you think and tell us what we should be doing.
Right.
It's like, well, first off, you're assuming you're broken. You're not.
Right.
And you know exactly what you need to do.
Right.
The question is how we're going to do this in a way that everyone feels like they're contributing.
Right.
Which isn't an easy thing to do, but it's not complicated, and it's nothing new.
Right. No, because it was really Jane Jacobs who
Yeah.
was the urbanist and community activist, and she actually started as a journalist, who really was against Robert Moses, who had this belief that the cities were made of buildings.
Yeah.
And he believed that cities should be created because they were for cars.
Correct.
And she was really about, no, cities are about the people. And they may seem chaotic and, sort of how they're laid out in the plan and how people move and use them. And that will change and evolve based on that. But it's all about the people. And so I think that also when you talk about Meals on Wheels, what people also liked was the fact that for so many who are isolated and the epidemic of loneliness, what it also gave them was they knew that this person was going to come every Monday and sit with them and talk to them.
Yeah.
So if we get them back out in the community, or even like in a space like a library where there's not only, it used to be like you could never have a drink in a library.
Right.
Now they sell coffee.
Yeah.
So that someone even, who could just come, who's elderly and retired could come and sit and maybe interact and see what's going on and sort of, people watch. And and then, then the librarian might notice this person every day and they start to talk. And then if they're not there one day, and so it sort of builds that sense of community.
Right.
So getting people also out of these situations where they are isolated to have ways to integrate and engage in the community.
And your gut instinct of how those problems should be solved, I think, kind of imprinted on you as a young age. There was this research project that I was exposed to in grad school that I never forgot, where they did these planning charrettes where they let kids design cities, but they separated out two groups, one that grew up in the inner city, one that grew up in the suburbs.
Right.
They gave them the same kid parts, or just like cutouts of
Right.
things. The suburban kids, and they were young, like second grade maybe, all grabbed their own house. They decided where everyone's going to live, and they figured out how to connect them. And everyone on the inner city side made all the streets, figured out how they were all going to be a group, and then at the end decided where you would live.
Right.
And just the priority of how we're defining us is very different, and it's why all the zip code analysis is so interesting, is that you can tell so much more than you should be able to about someone's health, livelihood, and happiness, frankly, by their zip code than almost any other metric.
Right. Well, they say that your zip code has more to do with indicating mortality rates than your genetic code.
Yeah.
So that's a very significant.
By a large factor.
And that's because of access to other. What attributes that?
A lot of things. I mean, everything from a really odd way of doing appraisals.
Okay.
Right. I mean, we've now got into this instinctive habit that we build communities around monocultures.
Okay. Right. Which is the idea that what you're saying is this whole idea of diversity and inclusivity. The monoculture is the idea of building a community where everybody is the same,
Well,
right?
the system assumes that that's the only way it can happen.
Right.
If you build a $100,000 home next to a $300,000 home, there'd be chaos in the current structure.
Right.
You couldn't even get a loan for something like that. But give me one good reason why. Right.
Well, you say that one of the great things of doing that is also this idea of the nosy neighbor, and you don't want everybody who leaves for work at the same time comes home at the same time, because then you were talking about the idea that you want people with different, so that somebody's watching the neighborhood, because if there was for crime, if they knew that everyone in a neighborhood leaves at 8:30 and they're not back till 6, and those homes are all empty during the day, that's prime. But if they have a neighbor who's sitting out on the porch, or
that's a lot easier to do in the urban condition. Maybe in some ways that's the best thing Jane Jacobs gave us, was this idea that Eyes on the Street was providing more value than you would ever imagine in terms of a neighborhood's safety and social cohesion.
Right.
The problem is we spend so much time talking about diversified income.
Right.
We don't spend a lot of time talking about diversified time.
Right.
And
you mean by that what people's schedules are, or when they're home?
I don't know if this is still true. It was true in 2005 that by and large nonviolent crimes were much higher in gated communities. Stuff gets stolen.
Right.
Because you know who has stuff.
Right.
It's a gated community.
Right.
We drew a highlighter around people that have nice stuff. And then we're shocked that that's where
where crime is. Right.
But what the research sometimes ignored was the fact that it's also a neighborhood where I can tell you almost to the dot what time people are leaving, what time they'll come home. I can tell you. I can tell you I walk down the street and know that no one on this entire street's home right now.
Right.
That's not a safe condition either.
Right, because if something happens, or if you happen to be home,
or someone that recognizes a stranger or an odd moving van that's backing up to the house where I know they're not moving, those types of scenarios and structures are extremely dangerous.
Well, we have this, sort of the bewitched model of the Miss Agnes, the terrible nosy neighbor, but there is a sense that they play a role, and they're important in the community.
When I moved to Fort Wayne, I had a Noreen. And my friends were like, you need to get a home security system. It's like, I don't need one. The 98-year-old woman across the street has called the cops on my brother twice for looking through the windows, right? And she knew, she was on top of it. And then she'd come over when I got home and said, there's a guy. I was like, well, that's my brother. Don't worry about it.
Right.
But you automatically feel safe.
Yeah.
My neighborhood got my back. They're on top of it. When I'm gone for a while, they'll take care of my stuff. And that so often gets overlooked, I think, in these discussions, that blindly get phrased as diversified income levels, or diversified by ethnic origin.
Right.
All these things are important, but equally important is this idea of time. So, because the time at least gives you a sense of how people are interacting and moving. It has more of a four-dimensional quality to it, where the others come from a more of a contextual, cultural diversity.
Right.
This has to do with actual tangible activity,
right?
Which are equally important, but they're very different in how they interact with one another.
And how you would develop and structure a neighborhood. I mean, you and I have talked about this whole idea of community versus culture versus identity, and the idea that we're so afraid of, we want inclusivity and we don't want diversity, but when people travel and they go to cities, what is the one thing they all want to do? They want to go to the different neighborhoods and experience them and see what Little Italy is like, or Chinatown, or and then experience the restaurants. And we're very good at accepting diversity with restaurants. Like if we go to a Chinese restaurant, we don't expect them to also serve burgers. So we know the expectation is you're going to a Chinese restaurant, you're going to have Chinese food. If you don't want Chinese food, then you can go to different restaurants. Right. But we're not good about understanding the offering of a specific inclusivity of a specific group in a defined area or place, so that it's not saying that they're exclusive to everybody else. They're welcoming to everybody, but this is the experience you're going to have. And I just fear that when we talk about so much today about the importance of inclusivity, and it's just that we're going to lose so much of the culture and the fabric of so much of what these neighborhoods offered in terms of not only our history, but people's identity and their experience within their own cultural groups.
Sometimes I think it's a branding problem, because at one level, at the neighborhood level, you see a sincere interest to want to be inclusive, which people interpret as a real hesitancy to have an identity. Because the second we have an identity means we're going to exclude somebody else.
Right.
And for so long, we've used adjectives to define our identity as cultural categories. Little Italy, Chinatown. And that's a lot harder to do now, and frankly, probably not necessary. But then now these neighbors are left with a problem of defining their identity in an environment where that becomes a political problem. And that is when people say, well, come in and talk to this community. What do you think they need? I think you need to leave them alone and let them grow and fearlessly proclaim what their identity is.
Right.
I was an enormous fan of Anthony Bourdain, right? Just adored the show, and maybe one of the best educational experiences for an architect ever was his shows.
Why?
I don't know of a better person, maybe since Jacobs, that so quickly and beautifully could articulate a sense of place.
Well, I think those are their skills as a writer and a journalist.
He's phenomenal. But here's a guy who's really a trained cook. That just had an innate ability to understand a place
Right.
and its people,
Right.
and appreciate the things that should be appreciated,
Right.
and ignore and let slide the things
Well,
that are
that's
important.
what James Jacobs talked about, the importance of observation and really paying attention and watching how things, how things are used. But one of the things that you talk about is that the people have the ability to sort of set the agenda for their neighborhood and their community. And they have the ability to create it the way that they want in sort of this micro environment. But you also talk about why zoning is so important for people to understand and to think about. And so, most people would think, well, I don't know anything about city zoning. Why is that important when it comes to community and neighborhoods?
Well, it's an interesting, I guess, time to talk about zoning. Zoning was the outbirth of the plague.
Okay.
So the reason we had zoning was we were going to start quarantining off sectors of the community to safeguard us against disease.
Okay.
That evolved into kind of the Green Cities movement of
So was that like in the 1908, like that whole time?
Black Plague.
Okay.
Way
back.
Way,
Okay.
way back.
Because you did have, like in the 1900s, you did have the
Yeah.
idea of all the immigrants coming in, like through Ellis Island and
Yeah.
those issues.
So that kind of evolved into the Green City movement that tried to separate out the dangers of industry, which was an unhealthy environment by itself, just
Okay.
dirt, grime, cattle. So the suburbs was a place you would go to heal and be away from the
Right.
city.
Right.
And that's really a dichotomy that hasn't ever changed since, right?
Right. Like people escape the
right.
dirt and the grime and everything, the hard of the city to go live in the
But now,
suburbs.
from this, circling back to the zip code analysis,
Yeah.
what we're finding is, by and large, I'm probably healthier in the urban condition now.
Right.
Because the dangers of industry are long gone, for the most part.
Right.
And the isolation of those suburban conditions is far more dangerous.
Right.
Both emotionally and physically.
Like in my apartment building here, there's a couple of people who are single. So we sort of have this joke, like if we don't, and one of the gentlemen has a dog, and I think dogs are a great way for people to meet people and interact. So we have this joke, like if we don't see each other within like 2 days, we'll do like a health check.
Yeah.
Because I think about like I live by myself, and if I work at home, there's nobody who's checking on me or wondering where I am. So I always think, how long would it take to somebody to find me if I slipped and fell in the shower? So you sort of also the sense of you create your own neighborhood, sense of family and community because of the fact that so many people are living apart from their actual families.
And that's what kind of these virtual communities need to recognize, is the fact that they're helpful in a way, in a lot of ways, but they're in no stretch of imagination a replacement from having social connections within physical proximity of yourself. That is very different. You can have 1,000 Facebook friends. From a sense of quality of life and a sense of attachment to the community in which you claim, nothing can replace a friend that lives nearby.
Right.
The physical connection was, I'm going to get it wrong, women are like 400% more likely to survive breast cancer
if they have friends, right?
10
and
friends.
it's why women will do better if they are a widow than a male widower, because they have that system and those connections. And it's why also you look at why men are healthier if they're married, is because they do have someone who's looking out for them and checking. And
that's what's dangerous about all these aging demographic, all this other stuff we're talking about, is the vast majority of people's social network of physical friends it stops at their spouse.
Right.
So as the baby boomers age, you're literally one funeral away from being completely alone.
Right.
Completely alone.
Right.
And we just don't currently have the structure to help support that.
And we also have the fastest growing segment of the living situation is single women, because a lot of people are not getting married or they're getting married. So you have that a lot more women are living by themselves. So I always have thought about that. Like, that's why I say this, like, check it of how long it would take. But so let's talk about this idea, though, that you've sort of you took it sort of by the horns and you're starting to create your own little neighborhood there where you live, because your brother, so your brother lives next to you.
Yep.
And then somehow you finagled your best friend to buy a house behind you.
Who married my cousin.
Okay.
And they live behind us, so our
Okay.
backyards touch.
All right. So what's going on there?
We all lived in Fort Wayne, kind of on all three corners of Fort Wayne or whatever that is. Hung out every weekend and thought that's really silly. Life's too short. My wife and I were looking for a house. We liked a specific neighborhood. My best friend and his wife texted me out of the blue one night and said, I think we accidentally bought a house today. We put an offer on that they took, and it was in our neighborhood that we didn't live in yet. And it made my wife mad, and my wife mad, she does things. So within 10 days we had bought a house that touched them. And really, I think with it wasn't a perfect house. It wasn't, in isolation, it wouldn't be probably what I said, that's what I want.
Right.
You never want to pick a house with an architect. That's a
Right.
horrible
I was
task.
going to say,
It's miserable.
Right.
But it boiled down to, what are we waiting for? Why not? Well, give me one reason why. And then within months, the house 2 doors down from me went up for sale. And it was almost kind of like, right before that, my brother was going to buy a house in that same neighborhood, but 5-minute walk away. And we were like, no, it's too far. It's not close enough. And then 2 houses down, and we bought it. And it has been really interesting to see the dynamic of our kids. We all have 2 kids. Each family has 2 kids.
And are they all around the same age?
No, mine are a little older.
Okay.
But it's kind of in a wooded area. Before I came here, I was at home with my boys. I text my cousin and say they're on their way. They just run through the woods, go to their aunt's house, and I come here. And when I get back, I'll text, and they'll just, you'll see them running through the woods.
So it's also allowing them to have that independence and being out in a neighborhood,
Correct.
which kids don't have anymore.
And they can't go anywhere without a relative seeing them, wherever they go.
So how did you get your brother to get the house next to you?
I think, honestly, if you ask him, I think he was getting really upset that
he wasn't included.
My cousin was seeing, when she looks out her back window, while she's sitting at the kitchen, my boys were in her backyard. And Jake's like, well, this is unfair. I said, well, then go buy a house. It's easy. You can solve this problem.
Right.
And I think, that's a silly personal example, but I think too often some of these problems are just, if you want to do something about it,
it's the same, where it used to be that multi-generations, it's changing now that multi-generations are living in a house, or they had the in-law, little suite, or they did the, one apartment on the first floor and then the second floor apartments. But so in creating this sort of neighborhood within a neighborhood for yourself, what are some of the things that it's taught you? And what are some of the things that how you look at as an architect, and when you're doing these comprehensive plans, or someone comes to you and says, take a look at our neighborhoods. What do you think has changed and influenced you from that?
For living in a commune like that? How easy it is. Whenever someone hears about our situation, they say, oh, how lucky.
Right. Well, there's probably 2. There's, oh, how lucky, but then how do you create boundaries?
Right.
Yeah.
I get both of those.
Yeah.
Neither one I accept. So one is, it's not lucky. It
was
planned.
intentional.
Yeah, we did it. I didn't win a lottery and get a house. It's easy. You could do it too. And then the boundary thing is, I think, silly too, because it, I think, plays into this myth that we have control over all these things, right? I'm only going to see my brother when I schedule it. Well, that's how I interact with my doctor, not my brother, right? I like the fact that when I'm mowing my grass, I can pick up something and throw it and hit him. I like the fact that
you like those serendipitous encounters.
I don't even know when I'm going to see him next.
Right.
I couldn't even tell you the next time I'm going to see him. I know it'll be within the next 24 hours. I don't know when.
Right.
I don't know when he'll need something. I don't know when a tool's missing from my garage. He's been in my house. I like the fact that in that sense we are a 3-household family. No
Well, a
different
unit,
than,
and- yeah.
no different than a 10-household pocket neighborhood,
Right.
right?
Right. Well, that's what you're doing.
Yeah,
You're creating
we're
that.
sharing a commons. We just included our homes as part of it. And the boundary thing, it's never been a problem. It works itself out.
Right.
I reject the notion that you should accept the fact that you should have to schedule time to see your loved ones. And that never was the case before. That's why front porches are so great.
Right.
I'm allowed to walk up here unannounced. If you don't want to answer your door, don't answer your door.
Right.
But I don't feel bad walking up here and just knocking without telling you I'm coming over.
Right.
And now because we don't have that buffer, you do. You text someone and say, I'm in your driveway.
Right.
Because I don't feel like coming to the front door because that's weird. It's not weird. That's how we've interacted for a millennia up till 1942.
Right.
And to me, that's what has been really interesting, is that my hope is that all 6 of our kids think that's normal. And
Yeah.
that's the part I like
Yeah.
about it.
Yeah. Well, clearly we didn't get to even an eighth of what I wanted to talk about. So you have to promise me that you will
Deal.
come back. But at the end of each And Good Company program, I ask guests the same 12 questions
Oh, no.
that
Okay.
were made popular by the French author Marcel Proust, who he popularized them from a Victorian parlor game.
Okay.
And the belief is that through your answers, we will get an insight into your true nature.
Oh my. Okay.
So, what is your favorite word?
Reciprocal.
Reciprocal?
Yes.
Okay. What is your least favorite word?
Impossible.
Or you could turn that into I'm possible. Just add a little,
Yeah, I like that better.
yeah. What turns you on creatively, spiritually, or emotionally?
Trying to solve problems that people say can't be solved.
What turns you off creatively, spiritually, or emotionally?
When people tell me it can't be done.
What sound or noise do you love?
Rain.
What sound or noise do you hate?
Nails on a chalkboard.
What profession other than your own would you like to attempt?
Author.
Well, we're working on that.
Yeah, we're trying.
What profession would you like to not do?
I couldn't be a teacher.
Really?
I'd love to tell myself I could be, but
What do you consider your greatest achievement?
raising 2 boys.
Who, living or dead, would you most like to have a conversation with?
Christopher Hitchens.
The author? Oh, no, the
Journalist.
The journalist. Why? Oh, I'm not supposed to ask that. But
I don't agree with everything he said, but he does it so articulately. I can't imagine a better dinner guest ever.
the conversation, right?
Yeah,
How would you like to die?
old.
If heaven exists, what would you like to hear God say when you arrive at the pearly gates?
I've heard about you.
Well, I think you can clearly see why I wanted to have Zach Benedict at this table. And this conversation could go on for hours. He actually has promised me that he will come back. And I want to thank you for joining us. And I hope that you will join us next time when you can again enjoy a seat at the table for great conversation and good company.